Hello. Last night I had Yauheni Preiherman with me, with whom I talked about Belarus situation in the current geopolitical situation in the war in Ukraine, and just in general how Belarus foreign policy is doing. Yauheni is the founder and director of the Minsk Dialogue Council on International Relations, situated in Belarus. He's a member of several professional networks, including the Younger Generation Leaders Network on Euro-Atlantic Security, the Collective Security Initiative, and the British International Studies Association. He's also an advisory board member at the International Institute for Peace in Austria. He's quite a peace-minded activist, analyst, and thinker. Yauheni got his BA in IR from the Belarusian State University. He got an MA in European politics from Sussex University, and a PhD in politics and international studies from Warwick University. He's truly somebody who knows several sides of European politics in a practical and a theoretical way. I hope you'll enjoy the talk. Well, thank you very much, Yauheni, for taking the time of talking to me today.
It's a great honor. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, Yauheni, you and I, we wrote a book chapter together about Belarus neutrality since the end of the Cold War and up until about 2020. And in that chapter, you explain very well how Belarus has been towing a very difficult line between being completely allied with Russia and being like always like a little bit neutral again. And recently, Belarus in this February, just before the war started, gave up its neutrality. So Belarus is actually the first of 3 neutrals that we lost in Europe this year. How is Belarus foreign policy developing, or how has it been developing since 2020, and where does it stand today? Can you explain to our viewers where you are?
Well, we should probably first explain it a little bit to those who are not well familiar with the Belarusian context, that Belarus has not been neutral in a classical sense, or even it hasn't been a non-aligned country. It did have a clause in its constitution, which was introduced there in the mid-90s, which says that Belarus aspired to become neutral. That was always a little bit of a strange wording, because in the early 1990s, Belarus joined what was then called Collective Security Treaty. And that was a treaty which some former Soviet republics established and joined after the Soviet Union had collapsed, but they still wanted to maintain cooperative links between themselves in the realm of security. And primarily, they wanted to remain somehow covered by Russian security, well, guarantees, if you will, or just Russian security assistance. Belarus, by the way, hesitated in the initial months after that treaty was concluded, but then it was decided primarily on the ground of very pragmatic reasoning that it was beneficial to the Belarusian military-industrial complex, but also to the Belarusian defense architecture, given all the problems that the country faced. So it did join the treaty. And then in 2002, the treaty was turned into a fully fledged military defensive organization, an alliance, basically, defensive alliance. On top of that, Belarus has had bilateral defense commitments with the Russians as part of what is called the Union State of Belarus and Russia. And we've seen lots of things happening within that Union State, especially in the realm of economics and in the political sphere. But then security has always been quite calm, and it was considered like the sacred cow of that cooperation. So people on both sides thought that their military cooperation was very successful. So in this respect, of course, Belarus has never been neutral, but it still had this clause in the constitution, and its foreign policy contained a big component of what I call neutrality-leaning behavior, or you might call it neutralist behavior. I recently defended my PhD where I offered a theoretical model of what Belarusian foreign policy looks like. And I expanded on this idea of hedging by introducing the model of foreign policy hedging, not strategic hedging, which you find pretty often in the literature right now. But I dealt with foreign policy hedging. We can talk about that in a bit more detail if you wish. But I just want to stress that you do have different types of foreign policy behavior within this model. And then the neutralist component is sort of central because it does unite sometimes diametrically aimed or diametrically directed other sort of vectors of your foreign policy. And that has been very characteristic of what Belarus has done, especially in terms of rhetoric, or as 𝗔𝗂𝘂𝘁𝘁𝘁𝘁 call it, the neutral talk, right? So we've seen a lot of that neutralist talk in Belarus, especially in the period between 2014, 2020, that is after the war broke out in Donbass. And Belarus then emphatically took what we conceptualized as situational neutrality. And that was another manifestation of this neutralist leading hedging behavior. So in this respect, unfortunately, indeed, we have lost the situational neutrality, and on a broader scale, we've lost a component of Belarusian foreign policy, which in my view was very important for regional security in Eastern Europe. And I would argue it wasn't just in my view, it was also in the views of many other, especially Western countries. And exactly for that reason, between 2015 and 2020, we saw the most sort of prolific and the best relations between Belarus and the US and the European Union, exactly because those countries understood why a neutrally leaning Belarus, at least in the context of regional affairs, was to everyone's benefit. And yes, it's now, at least it seems to be gone.
It's, I mean, Belarus, this kind of neutrality leaning side, or at least repeating in speech acts that Belarus was neutral, quote unquote, although that then never was like defined in the way that other countries would define it. But that went kind of away in 2020, right? With the protests that happened, and then like now Belarus is really very tightly integrating with Russia. Is that about correct? I mean, also part of the invasion on Ukraine happened through Belarusian territory. Can we say that this is a fundamental shift actually in Belarus foreign policy that hasn't been there since the collapse of the Soviet Union? Or how would you conceptualize this shift?
I think it is a fundamental shift. And, you know, it is pretty easy to understand the foreign policy of such states like Belarus, which we could call smaller or small in-between states, which are sort of stuck between competing rationalities, geopolitical rationalities, but more specifically security rationalities. And one clear characteristic of these states is that they need to react and adapt to the security environment, which they cannot shape on their own. So the fact that Belarus was pursuing lots of neutrally or neutralist leaning types of behavior in the past reflected the security environment, which was complicated by many things, and including this growing confrontation between Russia and the West, especially in the last decade and a half. But it still did leave space for other types of activities. And then neutrality leaning types of activities did look in the eyes of Belarusian policymakers as something which could bring some benefits politically, but also which could ensure the country's security better than just, you know, bandwagoning with Russia. And that's exactly what was happening. So in this way, you can say a little bit simplistically, perhaps, that what happened in 2020 with the internal confrontation and then this outburst of internal conflict between political opponents, it did limit the space for maneuvering for Belarus. And when you have this space limited, when you have the incumbent basically cornered by this internal confrontation, but also by growing amounts of Western sanctions, it's only natural, I think, in terms of international relations, to expect this incumbent to start doing what he is doing. And that is basically, I mean, in many respects, bandwagoning with Russia, because Russia is the source of security and stability, both for the political regime, but also for, the broader security arrangements in the country. But then if we develop on this a little bit, I should note something interesting. I think that between 2015 and 2020, this very topic of neutrality or neutralist behavior became so popular in society that you could hear more and more voices, both politically, but also, at simple societal level, basically arguing that this is our natural modus operandi in international relations. And at some point, even I thought that it was turning into a kind of a culture, a strategic culture, which could even, reach the level of what you see in Switzerland or in Austria, or what we used to see in Sweden, or to a different extent, Finland. But then the 2020 crisis put an end to that as well. Because in my view, when you are Belarus, and again, this is a small country which is sort of stuck in between geopolitical competition and geopolitical sort of zones of shared interest, but also not shared interest, right? Shared conflict. You can only sustain yourself as a kind of neutralist actor if there is unanimity in society around major political questions in your country, and neutrality is that one of those questions. But when you have an internal conflict, and even if opponents say it's not about our foreign policy, and this is what the Belarusian opposition has been arguing, they would be saying that, oh, it's only about us fighting against the authoritarian regime, and we are actually friendly towards the Russians. But you cannot have a protracted internal conflict in a country like Belarus, because it will inevitably quickly turn into a geopolitical one. And this is what we saw here. It's thankfully not the story like in Ukraine. So we didn't have a war here, even though unfortunately it was a realistic scenario. But it broke the very consensus in society. And unfortunately, we are now as far away from this idea of, neutrality unifying the whole nation as we've ever been. Even though I should say, I don't think that this is a completely gone thing. And if at some point there is a need for some unifying narrative and unifying story, it might serve the purpose. But again, it seems to be quite far away.
So what did Belarusian people, like your circle of friends and the people make out of this juxtaposition that at the same time that Russia demanded that Ukraine declare again its neutrality and be neutralized, right? That at the same time, Belarus was basically moving in the other direction very clearly already, right? With rewriting the constitution and like cutting out that article. And this has been very obvious to you for at least a year and a half or so, where this like voyage is going. But how did people react to that? Were there any voices that said, no, Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, we should all remain neutral? Or did that internally completely change after 2020 when you had these great protests?
Well, I still see a lot of opinions by common people, but also by political scientists or commentators who would be arguing in favor of Belarus neutrality. And some will even make this point, exactly like you put it, that Ukraine is sort of forced to move in the direction of a neutral. Then why don't we become the same type of a neutral? And then we shape some kind of a regional arrangement which ensures that the geopolitical confrontation between Russia and the West, or Russia and NATO, is shielded off for a longer time, and we all find ourselves in a more secure place. I think in general, theoretically, that does make a lot of sense, or at least it gives us a lot of interesting grounds to look for additional practical ideas. The problem has been exactly what I explained a second ago, and that has to do with the fact that the internal confrontation, which is basically a split in society, which has always been there in this or that way, but then it was aggravated by the political developments in 2020. It prevents the country from acting in a way that will ensure its best interest, but also ensure a potential practically feasible path towards neutrality. In this respect, we can think of those classical thinkers in international relations, including 𝗏𝘁𝘂𝘁𝗍𝘁, who has long explained why particularly a small country, but not only a small country, tends to underbalance, for example, when it is internally split and when it cannot sort of capitalize on all its potential to promote its interests. I think in many respects, it does explain what has happened in Belarus, and it does explain this process where the idea of neutrality has been lost as a practical possibility, I think, for years to come.
So basically, neutrality can at the moment not serve a purpose of basically pacifying society or like bringing society together in the way that, for example, it does in Moldova, right? Moldova is this interesting counterexample where like the internally there is a value to the concept also of like making sure the country doesn't break even further apart than it already is. But Belarus is in a different position in that sense, right? The fault lines are not geographical, but are very much through society, I suppose. Is that about correct?
Yeah, that's correct. By the way, we should probably add one additional dimension to this discussion, since I think what you mentioned about Moldova is very important. So it's not just about what society thinks and the need for society to be unanimous in its desire to basically, not fight for its neutrality, but ascertain itself as a neutral. But it's also what the other key actors think about your neutrality, right? We've always understood that you cannot become a neutral country if you are small and stuck in between competing geopolitical rationalities, unless this is somehow explained to the key actors outside of you that it's to the best of their interest. So I think it is now clear that for the Russians, the very idea of Belarus turning neutral or even becoming more active in promoting its neutralist agenda would be seen negatively. It would be seen as an attempt to basically start not running away from Russia, but walking away slowly from the Russian sphere of influence. And in this respect, the Moldovan experience is very interesting. I would encourage all of your viewers to follow the Moldovan case with great attention these days, because on the one hand, indeed, we do see that the narrative of neutrality does unite political forces. But then I do a little bit know about the Moldovan context from sort of some insiders, and there are some reasons to be worried about what may come next. And one thing is that I think increasingly in recent weeks, we see Moldovan politicians, while basically continuing to declare that neutrality is the course they are following, but still being more active in their relations and interactions with the West at the expense of the contacts with the Russians. Knowing the Russian political culture, I can assure you this cannot be met there with any positive attitudes. And it might indeed bring about some significant problems for Moldova. But that only explains, again, that many people in the Russian government structures tend to see neutrality not as a policy which can be beneficial to their own security interests, like what they say in the context of Ukraine, but they see it as a way for other countries to walk away from various things that Russia thinks is in their interest.
I mean, it makes utter sense, right? I mean, if Belarus became more neutral, it would be dissolving some of the ties it has built now. If Moldova if Ukraine becomes more neutral, it would mean like walking away from some of the Western integration. So in a sense, we are kind of in this sad moment, in this sad position where none of the greater powers is actually still very much interested to have a genuinely neutral buffer space. Everybody who can tries to grab whatever they can, and the in-between states are then getting torn apart.
Exactly, and unfortunately, this is why I'm pretty worried about the future of neutrality, but even non-alignment in Europe. And as you know, I recently wrote a short commentary, which, thanks to you, was promoted beyond the platform in Austria where it was originally published. And there I also opined about this. I think because of the increase in geopolitical incompatibilities that you find in Europe, but also because of a few other factors, the future of neutrality is at risk. And in my view, it is to our own interest to make sure that the very concept of neutrality and non-alignment at least remains sort of legitimate across Europe, so that perhaps it can serve us better a little bit later when the right times arrive.
Yeah, I mean, we're losing the buffer zones that can at least theoretically help to breach the gaps. But do you see, like in the war in Ukraine, for example, do you still see a role for Minsk as a platform to maybe bring about some form of end to the war and a ceasefire? I mean, Belarus did at the very beginning again play a role in trying to host talks, and then they moved to Turkey, and then they kind of like now dying down. Where do you see Minsk in this triangle with Moscow, Kiev? Where is it?
Well, in fact, what is important is not, of course, Minsk as the place where discussions, are organized, or a place which offers good offices, which it used to do, especially very intensively between 2015 and 2020. So such negotiations or talks can be arranged pretty much everywhere, and we now see, as you mentioned, those talks moving to Turkey. And then, has it changed anything? Of course not, because it was not about the place, it was about, the situation on the battlefield and a couple of other things. But why has it been so important for Minsk to perform this function of the provider of good offices in the past? And I would argue it remains important, and not just for Minsk, but for regional security, is because when you have Minsk as a provider of these offices, as a neutral ground, situational neutral ground, that means that Belarus is, well, not legally, but de facto somehow excluded from at least the most intense confrontational developments. And in my view, it is very clear to everyone that it has served not just Belarus well, but the whole regional security environment and situation. Because, again, not legally, but in a de facto way, Belarus has been able to help minimize military risk. And when you are the grounds of the talks, you have an additional important argument that's like the simplistic classics of this whole situation. You have an argument you can use vis-a-vis both sides, that it's better for them if they want the talks continued, and probably they do want, for their own reasons, the talks to succeed, then they are interested, they should be interested in having you outside of this conflict context. And then you can build on this. For example, in the Belarusian case, something which has always been important is that we have had a unique regionalized system of bilateral confidence and security building measures with our neighbors. Importantly, 3 of those neighbors are NATO members: Poland, Latvia, and Lithuania, and then Ukraine, which is not a NATO member, but we all know where Ukraine is. Those agreements were concluded in the early 2000s, but especially after 2015, they became really operational and really important in a practical sense. So in those days, we did have Belarus as a situational and neutral actor, and we did have those bilateral CSBMs, which are, by the way, concluded as part of Chapter 10 of the Vienna document. So they have a bit of more internationalized background. And those instruments, I've spoken to quite a few military people, both in Belarus, but also in those neighboring countries. They seem to work very well, even though, the media, the public did not know much about that, exactly for that reason. They did produce a very important layer of additional transparency and trust building. Now that you have Belarus without this possibility, at least for the time being, to continue serving as the neutral ground, we also see that the value of those bilateral agreements and bilateral measures, I mean, it's still theoretically important, but practically no one pays any attention to that. So to sum up, I think if we were to think about next steps in terms of regional security in Eastern Europe, both Belarusian potential to hold negotiations and to provide good offices, combined with this more technical potential of ensuring minimized security risk, can do a lot of good things for various actors in the region.
So where does Belarus foreign policy stand today when it comes to its immediate NATO neighbors and also to Ukraine? Is it like no contact? Are you being sanctioned as well? And I mean, are you basically not able to interact with them, or what's the situation for Belarus diplomatically?
I would say it's, hybrid, the popular word these days. So we have official diplomatic relations still there with all these countries. We have our embassies in all of those countries, even though, for instance, with Lithuania, the sort of actual diplomatic presence has been reduced to, I think, just one person on the ground in both countries. With Ukraine, for instance, we have still quite a few diplomats of Ukraine here in Minsk, but our diplomats left Kiev a couple of weeks ago, already about two months into the war. So in this respect, you still have diplomatic channels, but of course, they've been pretty much broken. First, when the sanctions began to be introduced by the European Union, but also by Ukraine, this is something I always thought was a little bit, well, I shouldn't be using this word, but strange, at least from a realist perspective in international relations, that Ukraine tried to be a little bit, sometimes even one step ahead of the EU in introducing sanctions against Belarus, even though I think Ukraine was one of the major beneficiaries of cooperation with Belarus, both economically, but also in the security realm, for the reasons I mentioned before, because essentially Belarus situational neutrality guaranteed the security of Ukraine's northern border, Belarus-Ukraine border. And then once, the situational neutrality capacity was gone, we all know what happened, unfortunately, on February 24. So diplomats are there, but of course, it's no longer a type of relationship which used to be there, which was there until 2020. And it's not like any side is basically concluding that this is the end of the relations and we should, end everything. We should close all embassies and things like that. But I think there's been a very clear structural change in Belarusian foreign policy. We did mention it some minutes ago, and it has already had some implications for the diplomatic practicalities. For example, Belarus is now trying to redirect most of its diplomatic efforts from the European Union and European countries, which used to be number one priority, to Asian countries, Asia Pacific countries, where they now see more sort of potential. And of course, on the one hand, it is also strange because it is one thing to deal and trade and exchange investments with your immediate neighbors, which are economically quite powerful, like Poland, for example, and quite another to be looking for opportunities far away. But then if opportunities here are closed politically, then of course it's only natural for both human beings but also for states to look for alternatives.
And how's the relationship with Russia now? Did this become really warm and very, very, I mean, even closer than before, or is there still a form of like, let's be careful when it comes to being completely sucked into Russia's foreign policy orbit?
Well, I think the latter is always a kind of concern for any smaller country which gets into this very intensive and all-encompassing relationship with a major power. So, of course, there are a lot of concerns about sovereignty, about the national identity and things like that. At the same time, I think we currently see a lot of issues which were impossible to resolve between Belarus and Russia in the past being resolved right now, exactly because of the situation that both Belarus and Russia find themselves in. And I know for sure that Russia is now making quite a lot of concessions, which were pretty much impossible to extract from them in the past. On a broader scale, I think there has been an important shift in that relationship as well. Because while we were talking quite positively about the experience of Belarusian foreign policy in 2015, 2020, I always thought there was a serious problem there, which would need to be resolved at some point. Not to go into much detail, but what we saw happening between Minsk and Moscow after 2015 was what international relations scholars call intra-alliance security dilemma. So Moscow got into this confrontation and basically war in Donbass. Minsk was reluctant to offer its unequivocal support. Minsk was looking for opportunities to strengthen its own security, but also regional security via this more sort of neutrally leaning agenda. While Moscow did benefit from that in some respects, on the other side, they were afraid of being abandoned by its ally. And Minsk did not want to be actively involved in Russia's geopolitical games because it also didn't want to be tied by the developments on the Russian side, which it cannot control, but which will, inevitably affect Belarus' own security. So that created this intra-alliance security dilemma. And I was worried, as I mentioned before, that at some point this could have grown into a real problem between Moscow and Minsk. Now that the overall structural reality has changed, I think that that issue has gone. And at least that does give us a little bit of, prospects to avoid those bilateral tensions with Moscow.
Yeah, so are you in any sense worried that, the narrative of the West could come true, that Russia is a revisionist power that tries to rebuild the Soviet Union, and rebuilding the Soviet Union would, of course, mean swallowing up, for example, Belarus, right? That would be natural. But you are already in a union state, right? Belarus and Russia are in a very special, bilateral situation. Is there in your mind any scenario that you can imagine where Russia would basically swallow Belarus completely?
Well, it's always, unfortunately, a possibility. At least if we'll look at the history of international relations. And that's why I think a lot of people here do have this concern. Even though Belarus has been cornered by the circumstances, by the actions of Western powers. And in this respect, I think people here who make decisions and who are involved in diplomacy simply don't have time to be worrying about these things. They are trying to double down on their efforts to compensate for the losses that have been incurred by developments on the Western side, but also trying to think of a strategy in relation with Russia, which will maximize opportunities and minimize risks. Again, something very typically done by such countries. And while the overall concern and risk is big, and by the way, I think this is the worst moment for Belarusian sovereignty ever, exactly for all these reasons. And it started in 2020 when the country was not able to contain the internal conflict and to resolve it without somehow engaging external powers. But at the same time, we also know from history that there have been quite a few very successful small states who managed to develop and pursue strategies in their relations with bigger powers, whereby they would, on the one hand, gain a lot economically, first of all, but at the same time, be able to preserve their sovereignty and perhaps, even additionally develop some important intra-societal well, institutions or intra-societal traditions that in the longer term help to sustain sovereignty. But that's, of course, easily said, but not as easily done as we realize.
And Kazakhstan is doing something interesting right now. They had like huge uprisings and riots back in January this year that were very substantial. Or was it late last year? I forgot, but
it was January this year.
January this year, right? And now Kazakhstan is holding a referendum to change the constitution to basically give more power to parliament and disempower the presidency. We have to see how that works out, but that was to me very interesting, because Kazakhstan is also such a very, very, very strong presidential system, right? And well, Belarus is a very, very, very strong presidential system, if you put it like that. Do you see any kind of like internal political development that could move toward a Kazakhstan model that would somehow then try to resolve that internal political rivalry that you have across the society naturally, or is that not where Belarus is going?
I generally think there are a lot of commonalities between the Belarusian and the Kazakh cases. I remember once attending a conference in Italy where we were locked into a fantastic mansion around or close to Lake Como. And there were some leading Kazakh experts also in attendance. So we had some very open discussions, sometimes those you won't hear in the public. And there were so many similar approaches in foreign policy, but also in terms of how the internal level or internal dimension interacts with the foreign policy one. Because of course, in Kazakhstan, under Nazarbayev, we also had a very clear authoritarian government, and it would have all the same problems in terms of relations with Western powers when it comes to human rights and democracy records, even though Kazakhstan, because of its geopolitical position in Central Asia, because of its size, and of course, because of its natural resources, managed to promote itself quite more successfully, I would argue, in the Western world, and managed to establish many more lingering contacts with the West, with the US, including through sending a lot of its people, a lot of its young people to leading Western universities, and then ensuring that there are those lingering personal relationships between people who return to Kazakhstan to basically be part of the government and those elites across the world. But then, of course, it did not prevent Kazakhstan from having the ugly crisis which erupted early in January. And I'm not an expert in Kazakhstan, of course, but I think even experts still need to find out what exactly happened there and what kind of an internal struggle between the different factions it was, what provoked it. But of course, it also had a clear possibility of sort of turning into a geopolitical crisis, or at least, involving geopolitical actors. But then somehow, ironically and counterintuitively, Kazakhstan did invite not just Russia, but the Collective Security Treaty Organization, of which it is a member together with Belarus. So those troops, primarily the Russians, came on the ground to help pacify the situation. But then, the problem was resolved very quickly. This is what I meant when I said that Belarus was not able to resolve its own problem quickly enough. And the conflict did get geopoliticized. And that's why, we basically undermine the whole possibility of preserving unity and preserving the possibility for the government to be pursuing a foreign policy which is completely sort of disconnected with some of the most problematic issues inside society. Again, it might turn out that in Kazakhstan, they will also continue to have problems in this respect. But I think as of now, they've preserved this interesting capacity to promote what they think is better suited to their interests internationally, while still, of course, being very close to the Russians and also dependent on the Russians in many respects. And that's why it is also very interesting to read all those statements by the Kazakhstani officials when they, for instance, meet with the Russian president, Vladimir Putin, and that happens quite a few times in recent weeks, but then they make some decisions in foreign policy in the context of the war between Russia and Ukraine, which are clearly not what the Russians would like to see.
So also some form of balancing within the security environment that they're in, huh? So
absolutely. Again, I think that it is more about foreign policy hedging than just balancing or balance and act, because with the balance and act, I think you have a more simplistic idea of what happens in foreign policy, but hedging gives you an insight into how many different factors and variables out there, and how sometimes it's simply even impossible to put them into a logical sort of line of reasoning. And that's why you have a lot of things which are incompatible, which you cannot even explain, you cannot understand why they happen at the same time, but then they still do, and then they still have some kind of an generalized overarching strategic idea behind them.
So just to wrap this up, Yauheni, like if you look ahead to the second half of 2022 and into 2023, what would be your optimistic hope about how Eastern Europe could or should develop? If you had a realistic wish list of what you would hope would happen, what would it be?
I think it is now a time when we can only have, I cannot even say a positive scenario for the future, but at least we can avoid the most dramatic one, the most tragic one, if the war is contained within Ukraine's borders. And I need to apologize to my Ukrainian friends for saying this, but again, being a realist, I think this is the situation. And secondly, B, if there is some possibility to start a substantive and meaningful discussion about minimizing security risks, military risks in the region, because we've seen quite a dramatic change in terms of the security dilemma in recent months. We now see that something fundamental is changing on our borders with Poland, with NATO, expanding its presence, with Russia, well, basically conducting a war on Ukraine, but also changing its security arrangements, especially if and when Finland and Sweden join NATO. So if we manage to somehow stabilize this process and we manage to introduce those security and confidence building measures that can work, if we manage to start a discussion about a little bit broader things in terms of European security, including, arms race issues and arms control issues, then perhaps it can be not as bad. But if the war in Ukraine is not contained within this territory, if it escalates vertically and horizontally, then we are all in a big trouble, and primarily us here in Belarus and countries like Moldova, for example.
Okay, I was hoping to end on a happier note, but the situation is quite dire, and we all worry very much because Europe seems to be at a point where it unfortunately kind of rips itself apart. Let's hope that the de-escalation will start, and I cross fingers also for Minsk to be able to be part of that de-escalation. And Yauheni, I thank you very much for your time, and we'll talk again in the near future.
Thank you very much, Pascal, for inviting me, and thank you for all the great work you do on neutrality studies.
Thank you very much for that. We'll talk very soon.